Good evening, everybody. I'm Oliver Cummings, Nurole CEO. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's Nurole event. The heart of Nurole is a vision to build better boards. We believe better directors make for a better world. And by applying an open hiring marketplace model to the board hiring process, bringing the best of technology and human expertise together, we provide access to higher quality and more diverse board talent than a traditional search process. It took us over 5.5 years to do the first 1,000 placements, 1.5 years to do the next 1,000 placements, and we're on track to hit 1,000 placements this year, making us the market leader in board level hiring by some distance. It's been a hugely exciting journey, and I think we're only just getting started with our disruption of the board market. We're now seeing growing demand from our members for education, networking, and more from the board community of over 50,000 members from around the world. As part of that expansion of our offering to our members, I'm thrilled that you're all here for tonight's discussion, which is part of Nurole's event series, Making Good Reward Decisions, what every Remuneration Committee member needs to know. It's targeted at current Remco members, as well as anyone who's considering joining a remuneration committee at board level. We have an all-star panel that will offer the full range of perspectives as both chair, committee members, executives, and advisors. Christine Hodgson brings a chair and committee chair perspective as chair of Severn Trent PLC and senior independent director of Standard Chartered PLC, where she is chair of the remuneration committee. Tom Gosling brings an advisor perspective, having been a senior partner at PwC, where he established and led the firm's executive pay practice, advising multinational companies on corporate governance and executive pay. And right on cue, Tanuj Kapila-Shrami brings an executive and committee member perspective, having been the Chief Human Resources Officer at Standard Chartered Bank since November 2018. Tanuj is also a non-executive director of the board for Sainsbury's PLC and a member of their nomination and remuneration committees. I'm particularly pleased to be co-hosting this event with the team from 3XO, Rupert McNeil, who's previously the UK government's Chief People Officer, and prior to that, Group HR Director of Lloyds Banking Group, and Mike Aldred, who has 25 years of HR advisory experience, having held the HR Director roles in financial services, including Standard Chartered and Barclays. Shortly, I'll hand over to Rupert, who's going to be moderating tonight's panel. He'll start with a 20-minute session on how an effective Remco works and some practical advice, followed by a further 20 minutes on what does the future hold for Remcos and what are some of the developments that we should be aware of. Then we'll open it up for questions before wrapping up. We're keen to make this engaging. One of my pet hates is boring webinars where people are on transmit and might as well have recorded the session. So we really welcome questions and comments from you as the audience. I think we've got over 200 of you here this evening, and we'll sift through those answers at the end. In our latest podcast, which featured Sir Donald Bryden, he shared a wonderful gem on what he had learned as a board member. And he said to me, "Watch who leans in when you speak. If you spot that people are not leaning in when you're speaking, then you know you're probably speaking too much." Well, I'm most certainly leaning in now. Rupert, over to you to introduce 3XO and kick off the panel discussion.
Oliver, thanks so much. And it's really great to be doing this session with this panel. And thanks everyone for giving their time to join us. Well, this is really a topic that's very much in the space that 3XO specializes in. We are a practitioner consultancy. We work with boards, with executive teams, and with HR leaders to augment, integrate, support them dealing with hard strategic decisions in the people area, and that includes strategy implementation. It includes moving, dealing with complex operational issues that have big strategic impact as well. And that's actually really one of the key things about this particular seminar and particular topic, and one that we're all very passionate about, and it's great to be doing it. So I'm going to dive right in this first part, which is how does an effective Remco work, and what practical advice can we give to people who are operating on them or thinking of joining them? And I'd like to go, if I may, straight to you, Christine, because you're in the fantastic position of being both a chair of a very large organization and also a Remco chair and a lead NED, and you've experienced this. So first question is, from your perspective, what makes a great Remco? How do you look at that from the chairman's perspective and as the chair of the Remco?
Thank you. Thanks, Rupert, and thanks, everybody. Really nice to be with you all. So perhaps if I just start as chair of Remco, and I think, first of all, I'd just say that, like any committee, whatever whatever the topic, you want to make sure that you've got a diverse set of members who are all really engaged. You've got a really clear remit. You're very well briefed, you're well advised, and of course it's well chaired. So that all sounds really, really obvious, but I've seen these committees, and I've seen remuneration committees, which frankly can fail on a number of those fronts. And perhaps just to take a few aspects. I mean, first of all, it's a bit obvious to say what the remit is, but of course, you know, many remuneration committees have seen the remit expand. You know, it's not just about executive remuneration, but about looking at the remuneration practices and policies and of the entire organization. And I think it's very easy for Remcos to get sucked into just looking at executives. And, you know, for me, it's all about looking at that, yes, of course, in detail, because that's often from a PLC point of view where the spotlight will be, but making sure that those are fair and equitable in the context of what you're doing for the rest of the organization is so important. And I mean, one of the things that I think was really key at Standard Chartered is when you know, CEO ratios came in, which frankly was such a blunt instrument. Instead of just focusing on that and what we were and weren't going to disclose, but actually standing back and saying what we really should create is a fair pay charter and with some principles, and make sure that we're being equitable for everybody. So clear remit, and again, being well briefed. I mean, at the end of the day, the Remco chair needs a really good reward team, obviously. And I think, you know, you can get buried as a Remco chair in a sort of myriad of analyses, and really knowing what analyses you need and making sure that you have that. You know, I'm lucky, you know, looking at Mike Aldred and Tanuj, I've been lucky to work with them, you know, great professionals who can really help separate the wood from the trees, because, as I say, a Remco chair can get buried, and that can be a hopeless situation. You know, my point about being well advised, I think this is really key. And again, work with Tom Gosling, and I've seen some shocking advisors over the years where, frankly, they can also bury the Remco in endless analyses, endless benchmarking, which frankly is deeply unhelpful. And I think for me, a great Remco advisor is one that is not afraid to get off the fence. It's a bit like, often I always say, like with a great lawyer, you know, the lawyer that just says on the one hand this and on the one hand that, it really doesn't help you. But somebody who is in the market, really has their fingertips on what is happening and can tell you how things are going to be reacted to. When you're so close to it, you can't see it. And I remember one famous conversation many years ago with Tom, where a scorecard outcome had produced a particular result. And Tom was bold enough to say, actually, you know, if ever there was a year where your scorecard was irrelevant, this is the year. And I remember it as a cracking piece of advice, because, again, you can get so much just focused on an outcome that you can't see the fact that that outcome is just going to be the wrong answer. So I think just to finish up, just to say a few things about the membership and about the role of the chair. You're never going to be popular as the Remco chair. You know, if you're trying to win popularity, you just should never take the role, because you're navigating through executives on one side, investors on another. You will never please everybody. And so just by trying to be incredibly practical, extremely fair, transparent, you know, a lot of clarity as to how you reach your decisions, I think that will at least help you to you know, get respect from both sides. And I think increasingly, the other thing I would say is, you know, in my view, gone are the days where a Remco chair is aiming to get a sort of 99.9 result. Frankly, if they are, they're probably going to make the wrong decisions. I think you've got to be bold to do the right thing. And some people could look at my track record and say, I've been a disaster because I've managed to, as a Remco chair, to be twice on the register. I think that might put me in the Guinness Book of Records. I make no apology for both occasions, because I think in both occasions I did the right thing. Of course, you can learn, but I would probably do almost exactly the same if I had my time again at both those situations. And I think, again, you've got to have Remco members with you who are diverse in thinking. You don't want groupthink on remuneration. You don't want everybody agreeing. You want people to say, to come at things from different perspectives. And I think that's really key when you're, as a chair, when you're bringing together the right membership. Think about that, because you need challenging. You need to be, and you need to have a good debate. So I think it's a role not for the faint-hearted. I think it can be very rewarding as well. I always say the best you're ever going to get is a 0-0 draw, or maybe a score draw. But it's all about, I would say, transparency, clarity, and just not shying away from tough decisions. And perhaps, Rupert, I'll pause at that point.
Christine, fantastic insights. And I would like to just go straight to Mike, actually, who's, I think, Mike, you're occupying several positions as a Remco chair yourself now, but also you've been an advisor externally and internally. What's your take on what Christine's saying? And perhaps you might say a bit about the remit as well.
Yeah, I've worked with some fantastic chairs, and of course, Christine, you're always top of that list. You've covered some great points. I think for me, one of the really important things is being able to facilitate really high quality conversations. So there's a couple of things that are needed to make that happen. Some of it is just the technical stuff needs to be there. The content needs to be accurate, timely, and all of that good stuff. But what sometimes people underthink through is what I call the choreography of this, the organizing to make sure that, for instance, if there's going to be an argument about something, that it's a high quality and well-informed argument, and people aren't using the Remco meetings to sort of kind of get up to speed with what's happening, but you have a really quality and balanced perspective. And that requires a lot of collaborative working between both the chair, members, the supporting technical teams, and the independent advisor. If I had to sort of say, what do I wish that sometimes the Remco members would do more of, that it would be just being willing to say no. Sometimes the answer needs to be no to a proposal and to shift course. And sometimes there's a little bit of an unwillingness to do that because it's not necessarily people's preferred way of working. But I think all of these things that Christine mentioned are important. In terms of the remit question, I think thanks for highlighting that, Rupert. Traditionally, there were lots of organisations where, frankly, the Remco would basically concern itself with the payment of the board only, and that's important, and it's hugely important as well, and still remains important. I think that is changing quite quickly now, and I think that's a good thing. The cost base of most organisations, the people is the biggest cost base. So why wouldn't that be subject to detailed board scrutiny? So, I think one needs to be quite careful though in how you're practical in terms of how you organise that. So whilst it's practical for the Remco to look at the individual decisions of senior people, it's not practical for them to be doing the reviewing throughout the organisation. But there are useful things that they can do in terms of understanding and digging into that strategy. And I think that's a really productive thing where management teams come together to explain their decision making to the board and make that interchange of ideas practical. I'll stop because I think Christine wants to join.
Christine,
I just want to pick up on something Mike said about the high quality argument. There's one other ingredient I think to success is, and I agree, it's good to have those high quality debates. you've also got to make sure there is no surprises. I mean, to spring on an exec or something, a decision that you've taken that frankly is not that one that they would have expected, is an absolute catalyst for a very poor quality debate. And that's not to say ever that you should write the minutes of a Remco before you go in, but you absolutely should know, and the execs should know as well, the sort of the key things that are going to be debated. You should not ever spring them on them in a meeting.
Thanks, Christine. Tanuj, if I could come to you after what Mike and Christine have said, and maybe could I fire sort of two things at you on this? One is a question that's come from Simona in the chat, which is about the value of pre-committee discussion, and it'd be really great to get your take on that. But also the sort of the light or shadow that the Remco discussion casts on the rest of the organisation, from your perspective as both a Remco chair and a CPO.
Thank you, Rupert. First, it's great to be part of the discussion. Sorry, I was a few minutes late because I made the rookie error of joining via the participant link, not the speaker link. So I should have learned by now, but clearly I haven't. So apologies. Look, it's great to be part of this discussion. You know, Christine and Mike have covered so many points, but the 2 points that I will make before I get to your specific question is, I do believe, and you know, Christine spoke about it so eloquently, that Remco is the place which looks at the overall employment proposition on behalf of the board. And this idea that reward is a huge part of that employment proposition, but the proposition sort of goes beyond. And while you can't get into huge detail, the kind of conversation that happens around you know, looking at that proposition for the entire workforce is very important. And you know, it comes down to what are the kind of data insights that Remco is looking at. So, you know, what are the data sets? You know, what's the sort of narrative that's coming together? And also because the governance requirements of a Rem committee are so onerous, especially when you are in UK, how is Remco carving the time and space to have a strategic conversation? And, you know, I know in Standard Chartered with Christina as our chair, there is one meeting a year, which is a pure strategy meeting. And we choose the timing of that quite carefully, which is a relatively quite a period from a governance perspective. And that is where we have that blue sky conversation. And, you know, Christine will remember that the work that was done on fair pay came at the back of one of those strategy conversations. So I think it's incumbent upon Remcos to find the time and space to be able to look at what I call that employment proposition holistically, and find that space for that strategic conversation. So that's the sort of first point that I was going to make. In terms of the pre-committee, I mean, I love Mike's comment around choreography. You know, the content in the meeting is important, but the choreography that goes around it is quite important. I'm a firm believer, you know, both in my job as the head of HR, but also in the Remco that I sit on, both the Remcos, that the pre-meetings are quite important. And pre-meetings are not just to make the quality of discussion. You know, critics could argue that if you over-index towards pre-meetings, the conversation in the Remco meeting becomes a bit of a tick box. And I don't believe that to be the case. The value of pre-meetings is that actually a lot of the administrative process issues get aired out. So you're not spending a lot of time in Remco going through what I call mechanistic conversations or clarifying issues. And also, if pre-meetings are done well, you know, I think that's a very crucial input to the chair of Remco to be able to ask the poking, probing questions and ensure that all of the issues are surfaced in the meeting appropriately. You know, with the best will in the world, you've got defined time in the meeting, and both to ensure that we use the pre-meetings to iron out the mechanics and the process points, but come up with the points of challenge, contention, which then the chair brings into the committee meeting to have a conversation. And I found that, if done well, to result in a much higher quality discussion in the meeting itself.
And could I ask on that point, Tanuj? I mean, really, really great insights, and perhaps Christine and Mike and Tom as well. I mean, what is your feeling about the chair speaking to other members of the Remco pre the Remco meeting itself? or taking those or having those conversations again to make sure it's a well-constructed conversation in the room? Is that something that you tend to do, or is that something you tend to avoid? Tanish?
Well, my view is, and I mean, I love for Christine's view on this, and the reality is, it is quite important to have a conversation with each of the committee members before the meeting. And, typically my experience is that the process conversation is led by the reward sort of team, but then the head of reward or the head of HR, depending on what time of the year the conversation is happening, has a conversation with Remco chair to talk openly about some of the issues that have come up. And then the Remco chair takes a call to say, is there an opportunity to have a pre-meeting? So I do believe getting down to each of the Rem committee members is quite important. But for the Remco chair to do it for each of the committee members before might not really be needed. It all sort of depends on the time of the year, the conversation where you had. But getting down to each of the members before the meeting, I believe, is quite important. I don't know, Christine, whether you that or not.
Yeah, so just agree exactly what you said. I think largely left to the reward team, and so much, as Tanuj said, is just clarifying points, explaining things, which is just an efficiency point. I think typically, like many committee meetings, just before the meeting, then the non-execs would have of the Remco would have a session, just very short, and just to say, look, is there anything that is going to cause you a big concern? As Tanuja, you'd probably already have a good sense of that anyway, but it gives an opportunity, if there's somebody wants to vent about something, to get that out on the table. And then again, as a chair, it's not that you're trying to pre-run the meeting, it's just that you're then just alert to the key issues, and then helps you choreograph the meeting. So
Mike and Tom. Mike and then Tom.
Well, Tom first, and then I'll go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Tanuj described the role of the pre-meeting extremely well. And just one thing I wanted to highlight is the point Christine just made, which is the pre-meet is not to pre-run the meeting. And some of the real disasters that I have seen is when there's been a NEDS-only pre-meet, and then they announce that they've made all sorts of random and uninformed decisions, and they announce that to the meeting when everybody else comes in, and that's a real disaster. So it is really about flushing out any issues that then need to be addressed in the proper decision-making forum of the meeting.
Great, thanks, Tom. Mike.
I'd absolutely agree with that. Two points as well I wanted to add. One is prompted by one of the questions or challenges, actually, that Robert on the Q&A has asked, which is, look, are you talking about FTSE 100 Remcos? How's this applicable in a smaller organisation? I would say that a lot of the principles that we're talking about here have analogues in really much smaller organizations. So, if I'm thinking of one of the boards I'm associated with, actually via Nurole, is a school multi-academy trust, and actually the quality of discussion, even in that sort of much smaller environment, the quality of the board discussion could go up so much more by implementing some of these principles. Okay, it needs to be thought through what's proportionate, but simple things like making sure that you're not using the meeting time to kind of get up to speed, and if you need to articulate things outside of the meeting, you choose to do that, and you could just avoid daft things. I mean, I remember once when this is years ago now, when I was PwC and I was advising a privately owned FS organization, and we had a very lengthy Remco discussion. I was the advisor, but the board was having a discussion about shares versus options, and we thought it was a really good quality discussion. Got to the end of it, and then someone piped up and said, "Remind me, which ones are options again?" And the point being that sometimes there are some very points of that might seem obvious, but that need to be covered and best done outside of the meeting. I just wanted to pick up one thing, especially as we had Tom here as well, which is around the role of the advisor. And I've been an independent advisor. I've been a reward professional. I do some other things with some boards. The difference that an effective professional in this space can make is really enormous. And one of the things that I think has become a bit of a shame, actually, is one is advisors where their independence manifests itself in a kind of lack of collaboration, lack of communication, and everything becomes a bit random and unpredictable. And I kind of wanted to ask Tom, who's done that, made a whole fantastic career out of being, one of the top in the world, really, independent advisors. What does he think is, good in this space?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, I think a lot of it is about really understanding where you add value as an advisor. And Christine mentioned this at the beginning, in that, the first thing you do as an advisor is that you kind of provide knowledge and expertise. And frankly, that's not really that valuable to the committee, because they can get a lot of that from their in-house team, and it's obviously important. I mean, then the next level up, which is a bit more useful, is market insight, which is where you're kind of really got your finger on the pulse of what's happening elsewhere. And that can be genuinely, useful. The next level up is ideas to solve problems. And again, if you're prepared to show a bit of innovation, that works really well. But I think the bits where I've had Remco chairs say to me, wow, that was really disproportionately valuable, it really comes down to saying what needs to be said, but saying it in the right way and at the right time. And I think that's where the real skill in advice comes, and requires the advisor, to have really view themselves as a board advisor, so that everybody who is in the room feels that they're their advisor. So, where things go wrong, I think sometimes, is when, the advisor, either they feel that there's the need to demonstrate independence just by being kind of unpleasant to the CEO, right? That doesn't really work. Or they get trapped behind the Remco chair and become the Remco chair's advisor. That's another thing that can happen. Or they think that they should be running the show and, leading everything. And these are sort of pitfalls that advisors can fall into. So it's about really having, I think, advice works well where the advisor has good relationships with the chair, the CEO, the Remco chair, and the HR team, has the guts to say what needs to be said, but also the EQ to do that in an appropriate way, and not just set off hand grenades.
Could I just pick up that EQ point, Tom? Because it's very interesting for me. I don't think, and I don't think others would agree, that there is another part of the board domain which is so laden with emotion as this area, and all sorts of psychodynamics can come out in it. I mean, I've seen situations where, on the inside, not the consultant, as an HRD, I've seen a chief executive, basically ask for a pay rise, and the incoming chairman designate saying pretty much the words, "I really don't think you want to do that," and they went ahead and they weren't CEO for very long. So quite a lot of things get worked out in that, and I just wonder how. I mean, do you recognise that, and how do you handle that as an advisor?
Well,
the emotionality.
Yeah, I mean, I do really recognise that, and I mean, the Remco. It's amazing how many issues get flushed out in a Remco, and quite often, if there's a disagreement within the board about strategy, it quite often appears at the Remco, right? Bizarrely, because it either comes out in a target setting discussion or an evaluation discussion, and it is very emotional because it's where the board switches from being the critical friend of the CEO to being the CEO's evaluator, and this is very, very delicate territory. And I think that successful Remco chairs need to be very aware of a number of key relationships that they need to keep in balance. And that's with the most important triumvirate is really between the Remco chair, the chair, and the CEO. If that gets out of balance, it's a disaster. So if the Remco chair finds that the CEO and the chair have sort of ganged up against them, that's really, really bad news. So the Remco chair needs to be keeping that inclusive. I think the other Remco members are really important as well. So I always used to get worried when Remco members would say, "Oh, well, James, you're the one that's closest to this, so we'll go with your judgment." Quickly backing away from the discussion. The Remco chair become the CEO of the committee rather than the chair of the committee. So it's a very, very delicate role and requires a lot of skill and EQ from a Remco chair to keep all of those elements in balance, and then for them to know how to use the HR team and the advisor to support, positive outcomes. It's very easy for over-enthusiastic Remco chairs, to really, for it all to go horribly wrong, frankly.
Tanuj.
Well, I raised my hand and then had Tom sort of mention what I was going to say. I mean, we have to recognize that the REM cycle or the REM process does become the flashpoint for a lot of other issues getting aired. And a lot of people underestimate that. So, comments on strategy, sort of financial performance, overall comments around governance of the firm. So, in some ways, the REM cycle becomes the flashpoint, and that's where the emotions get heightened as well. So I think it's a really important point that, you might think going into the cycle that you've got a perfect REM policy, you've thought through all of the issues. And then as the year develops, there are broader issues that come up in the organization, the external environment, and REM conversations become the flashpoint. And that's where the emotion really comes in. I mean, the other point I will make is, I'm going to state the obvious, but you are thinking about multiple stakeholders. It's obviously the regulators, investors, your management, your executive directors, rest of the workforce. And while it's obvious, it surprises me how many Remcos don't fully get it, that, it is about making very thoughtful, pragmatic decisions, balancing these various stakeholders. And, you can so quickly weigh decisions in favor of one stakeholder or the other. And that's where emotions get heightened as well. So it's a real balancing act that way.
Thanks, Tanuj. Christine. Oh.
Yeah, just to follow up on the comment Tom made. I mean, about, to say what needs saying. I mean, I just don't think we should underestimate just quite how difficult that can be. And, whether the Remco chair or some of the Remco members are afraid to say it. But that's what really makes a good advisor, because quite often you are saying things that absolutely the executive may not want to hear. And it's really, Tom, as you said, it's really delicate. And unless I think that the Remco chair needs to make sure that they, are not just putting the advisor in harm's way to sort of shield themselves from, also saying what needs to be said. And and I think a lot of advisors that I've seen in the past are sort of not prepared to be bold to say it. And frankly, the Remco chair might have been underneath the table. But so I think really getting that right is just the difference between a successful and an unsuccessful Remco in my mind.
Thanks, Christine. And I wonder if we could now move on to sort of looking ahead at some of the trends and developments which people could expect to see on their Remco agendas in the coming decade, really. And Tom, I wonder if I could turn to you first, an area that you're doing a lot of thinking about and work in, which is the ESG area. I mean, Tanuj mentioned, and others have mentioned the link to strategy, the link to the wider organization. ESG is part of that. How do you see that role for the Remco shaping up?
Yeah, well, it's becoming increasingly important from a number of dimensions, and actually Christine and Tanuj have already mentioned one of those, and Mike indeed, around the broader remit of the Remco in terms of how they think about the wider employee proposition, the employee group being a very important stakeholder group within the organization. Perhaps the one I'll focus on, which is kind of more directly linked to the Remco's conventional remit, is this trend towards the incorporation of ESG targets into executive pay, which is really, it's been one of the hottest issues for Remco's over the last kind of year or so. And I mean, in a way, the debate about whether ESG targets should be included in pay or not is kind of, the ship sailed on that, because around 80% of companies now do include these targets in pay. But we do have a bit of an issue, because to my mind, the implementation quality of these targets is generally quite low. There's often not great transparency or clarity. And, there is a danger in overemphasizing kind of tick box ESG metrics in pay at the expense of other very important non-financial priorities for companies. So I think this is an area that needs to be dealt with quite delicately. Also because I think there are parts of the outside world that think that the purpose of ESG targets in pay is to enable Remcos to get these sort of nasty CEOs to do things they wouldn't otherwise do and take stakeholder considerations into account. And that's not really how it works. I mean, in fact, if you talk to organizations, they much more see ESG targets in pay as being a way of reinforcing a strategy that the board has decided upon throughout the organization, rather than being a sort of a CEO type control mechanism. But I think it is something where we've got to improve the quality of how this is done across the market generally. So, you know, happy to talk about some of those factors, but I mean, I think the starting point is that this is something that any Remco member is going to have to become au fait with.
And it ties into something else, which I'd be really interested to get Christian and Mike's view on particularly, which is, of course, one of the stakeholders that is in the room but not in the room are institutional investors and shareholders, and increasingly regulators as well. I just wonder how, Mike, Christine, you sort of see Remco's coping with that in terms of their work, particularly as actually both of those groups are also looking at the ESG area as well as many other things.
I mean, I'll
Mike.
go first,
Yeah,
Mike, if you
please.
so I think all the stakeholders want to see ESG in the, whether it's in the annual scorecard or the LTIP or both. I think, as Tom alluded to, it's still quite basic in many areas, and I think there's a lot of there's not a lot of consensus as to what the measures should be. Certainly, I think the conversations now are getting more sophisticated with, for example, institutional investors. And I think it really is, again, coming back to the role of the Remco chair, I think it's really, really important to make sure that you're creating targets that are quantifiable, as tangible as possible, not fluffy, just like you would with any other targets. And I totally agree with what Tom said, is that you can have ESG measures, but it shouldn't be at the expense of just taking out a lot of other strategic items, which frankly are also critical and should be on there. So I think getting that balance, it's all very fashionable to have a big, you know, a quite chunky percentage of ESG, but they shouldn't be exclusive. There should be other strategic measures in there.
I mean, Mike, would you like to? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of points on this. One is that I would absolutely encourage people to lean into the substance on this topic, rather than look for the quick wins of kind of, you know, some sticky plasters and look as though you're doing the right thing, because people ultimately will see through that when it's somewhat superficial. So I play the longer game and actually do the work to actually form a view and then be able to implement it. I mean, a couple of other slightly more general things on the sort of shareholder environment, and you know, I think these have, to a certain extent, always been true, but are increasingly becoming you know, absolutely vital. It's not enough. My first is that it's not enough just to make the right decisions, but you need to be able to explain them properly. And it's almost the most, for me, I think it's the most frustrating thing in the world, where people have made sometimes not particularly controversial decisions at all, and because of a lack of engagement or a lack of explanation, it just goes completely pear-shaped. I mean, you don't need to look too far at the moment to understand just how important it is to tell explain your plan. Whether people agree with that plan or not, lack of explanation and lack of engagement will definitely doom any plan. I think that's fair to say. The second is, I think one needs to think about both shareholder but also stakeholder more generally. So, you know, in financial services, that would also include regulators. Think of the support as a bit like currency, and it takes a while to build that support up. You need to think carefully about how you use that credit with stakeholders or with shareholders. Don't spend it on pursuing hobby horses. Spend it in terms of the things that are truly important to the organization. So that really, again, speaks to the Remco having this real commercial bent, of understanding what is strategically important to the organization, so that, you know, if you're asking for shareholders' trust, if you've got to that position where you just need them to express confidence in the Remco decision, that it's on the important stuff. Don't fritter it away on the kind of the nice to haves, or it's because, you know, sadly you sometimes see it with, you know, pleasing a particular executive or a particular board member. And I think this is going to become increasingly important as the nature of decision making gets more complex, and especially around this ESG, not just to be able to make the right decisions, but to fully explain why you've got to do that. I think this speaks to the fact that sometimes, you know, organizations should think about a variety of Remco advisors. Some Remco advisors will be stronger at some pieces than others. And, you know, there's nothing that locks people into just having a sole advisor. And I think, you know, that will become a bit of an emerging model sometimes. Although I would say that, wouldn't I?
Maybe we could move on to Tanuj. You raised the issue about the employee life cycle, and again about the sort of the role that the Remco plays more broadly, and as it moves, we were talking earlier as well, and Tom referenced it, into the broader area of looking at people issues more generally. And a few of the questions I can see in the Q&A are asking about culture, about values, about how that gets embedded in incentive arrangements. From your perspective, particularly as a CPO, what's your take on that, particularly the role in, for example, culture?
You know, the first thing I will say is that a lot of this is the S of ESG. You know, the E of ESG gets spoken about quite a bit, but the S doesn't. And I think increasingly for Remcos, the S, which was, to my mind, traditionally about risk management, there is a real shift towards what I call more pro-social behavior. So, you know, S is not just about managing risk. It's about, you know, thinking about sort of social behavior, much more sort of pro-social behavior. And I think that trend is a very positive trend, and one that you know, I'm particularly excited about. 2 points I will make, and you know, all the speakers, starting with Tom, spoke about it. The stickiness of the ESG agenda, you know, it's sustained when it is part of the core strategy of the bank. You know, you can get into sexy metrics, which are good mouse pads, t-shirt type of stuff, but if it's not part of your overall strategy, you know, it doesn't stick, and that leads to my mind, a friction as well, you know, within the organization. So you know, looking at the overall employment proposition, I look at it within the context of the strategy. You know, is the people strategy in support of the business priorities, business strategy? Are we thinking about a culture which is helping us deliver on the business agenda? And you know, it's quite important, I think, for boards, and I said that Remco to me is a subset of looking at some of these aspects on behalf of the board, to think about the overall sort of people culture agenda in context of the business strategy and stuff that is really moving the dial for the business. So I think that's important. Then it really comes down to what is the data that is being looked at. And, you know, Christine's a big one. You know, she gets really excited about at least the one Remco that I support her with. You know, she gets really excited about the data pack at the back of our overall REM pack. And of course, we sort of look at pay levels, the trends, but what we try and do is actually try and pull together a narrative which gives evidence of the progress that's been made on the overall people and culture agenda, and people to be able to see the link. And, you know, what's the exit data telling us? You know, what is the feedback that we are getting from employees across various channels? Are we being able to show tangible improvement on our diversity and inclusion sort of metrics? Are there specific feedback that we are getting around the other aspect of culture, which is conduct? And, you know, are we being able to capture that? So there is an opportunity, I think, to look at these decisions in the context of the overall people strategy, which is aligned with the business strategy, and then bring together data to Remco in a digestible way, which explains the whole narrative coherently.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tanuj. Oliver, I think we can probably move now to some questions. If you want to flag up some of the themes we're seeing. I know we've picked up a few as we've gone through the conversation, but perhaps you could throw some out for us.
Yeah, well, we've had some great engagement, and it's not too late if you want to put questions in there or upvote them. We'll work through them, and any we don't get through, we can try to pick up in a written form afterwards if I can persuade some of the panelists to contribute.
Definitely, we'll do that. Yeah.
On that. So I'll start with the top voted question, which comes from Stephen Page, which is around most workforces, especially those with a low paid contingent, are starting to feel the harsh cost of living pressures. Creativity is needed to help our employees through this difficult time, as well as to avoid a perception of unfairness. How do you see the work of the Remco evolving in this area? Who'd like to pick that up?
I'm going to abuse the chair's privilege and just jump in on that one first, but then perhaps I could turn to Christine with the size of her workforce. But I think it's really interesting here. I'm so glad the word creativity was used, and I think this ties into me with this broader point about the people agenda and the fact that there are many parts of the employee value proposition that can be looked at and should be looked at holistically, and are they being made the most of? And I think there's actually a great opportunity in this environment for Remcos to work collaboratively with unions, with management, and look at some of those tough decisions that are going to be driven by this quite difficult or very difficult set of headwinds we're dealing with. Christine, how are you in practice looking at in the environment you're in?
So it's coming up in every board, isn't it? And I think it all goes back to sort of being authentic and being fair. And I think that what you're seeing is, of course, there's this huge uncertainty and nobody quite knows the scale of the problem. But I think from a creativity point of view, yeah, you know, we're seeing one-off packages of support, particularly for those really suffering hardship. You're seeing pay rises being very much skewed to the lower paid. I think it's absolutely on the agenda of the Remco, and it should very much be part of the remit, because at the end of the day, you are trying to make sure that you're being fair, and you certainly don't want a workforce that is in any way on the breadline. So really key.
Can I just add one other thing here, and very briefly, make sure you understand the practical reality and consequences of the decisions that are being made, and that is very important. And if there's ever a case for making sure that you are using data-based decision making, this is absolutely right. If you're not using analytics to support focused decision making on this, you're definitely not doing it right.
Could I go, Mike, just to build on that great point? I think one of the next most popular questions is from Amy, which is about who should be in the room, from Amy Chappell. So maybe you could just give your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, members, obviously, I think it's increasingly important that for appropriate sections of the meeting, at least, you have real exposure to the management team. So that would obviously include, for much of the meeting, I would argue, the CEO, the CFO. I think also increasingly important has become the risk inputs, risk and compliance inputs, and I think that's something that's become important. There is appropriate time for, you know, the NEDs only discussions if needed, but I think that should be I think a healthy balance is for that to be sort of minimised, really, rather than it to become the norm. Obviously, the independent advisor and also the, if you like, the support structure. So, you know, your HR folk, your reward folk, also company secretariat playing a role with tying up to the board. I think the related question as well that I think a number of people have asked is, you know, whether you should be, you know, where various questions like culture and things like this should that be in the Remco or another committee or something like that? It's kind of the other way around. I would absolutely challenge boards, if they are not expanding the remit of the Remco to be this broader people committee, then, you know, the challenge is, how else are you going to make sure that these important people type HR questions get considered and get that board level scrutiny. I mean, there's lots of different ways of doing it, but it does need to be done, I think, in a modern organisation.
Tanuj.
You know, can I sort of add to this cost of living crisis, because it is such a topical, you know, conversation at this point in time. And Rupert, I love the point around creativity and innovation. So both from my experience in financial services, but of the Remco of a retailer where I sit, it's been really, really interesting to think about the challenge expansively. And, you know, some of the conversations we've had around is being very forensic, leveraging data on where are the pockets that need to be ring-fenced in terms of comp increases. But actually, what else is available? You know, we've sort of explored areas like staff discounts. We have looked at sort of, you know, flexible working and what is the impact that has on sort of travel costs, etc. So it's quite easy, and this is really an opportunity for REM committees, you know, to think about this challenge and challenge the management team, you know, your HR directors, award directors, to think about really what is it that the employees want. Are you listening to the employees? Are you listening to your colleagues to really understand what the points of challenge are and struggle are? And how are you thinking about responding to that in a bit of a creative way? So they are, you know, for those of you who are involved in this conversation, it's very easy to start off with the simplest answer, which is to increase everyone's pay. And I'm not saying that you don't need to do that for areas, but there are loads of other levers that need to be thought about in the context of the crisis. So just to add to that.
Oh, that's fantastic, Oliver. I think we'll certainly follow up with the great questions have been asked to make sure everyone gets a response. Fantastic questions. Just as we come to the end, and before I hand back to you, Oliver, I wonder if we could just quickly go round and get any final thoughts from each of our panel members. Tanuj, and then perhaps Christine.
I mean, look, so much has been sort of covered. I mean, the point I will make is it is an exciting opportunity, you know, being part of REM committees, you know, chairing sort of REM committees, but it is about challenging yourself to not define the role very narrowly. And, you know, I think it's easy to get into the trap of, you know, these are the REM discussions and rest is not. But the world that we are staring into, whether you look at Great Resignation, look at cost of living crisis, it's become quite difficult to look at some of these issues. And my strong encouragement always is to take much more of a holistic approach and look at sort of your EVP, your employment proposition, far more holistically. That's the only thing I will say. Thank you.
So true. Fantastic. Christine.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And perhaps another point that we've not really discussed is also the need for very fulsome disclosure. I think more and more as a Remco, you've got to be prepared to lay out, you know, in your director's remuneration report exactly how you've got to the conclusions, even when you've made conclusions that you that are doing nothing, but you've got to say how you got to actually take no action. And I think you mentioned regulators earlier on, Rupert. I think increasingly regulators in all sectors want to know that you are thinking about compliance, you're thinking about incidents and all the rest of it, and you're embedding that in your decisions. So I would say really be very thoughtful on disclosure.
Fantastic. Tom.
Yeah, so I think there are two real keys for success in chairing a Remco. So one is nurturing successful relationships, and that's with the CEO, with the chair, with the other Remco members, with investors, with the HR team, with the advisor. And the second is establishing processes that set yourself up for success and set yourself up for the right flows of information to enable the right decisions to be made. And it always surprises me actually how many companies ignore the importance of good processes when it comes to running a Remco, but they can really massively help keep stuff on track.
Fantastic. Mike.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is, because I know some of the folk attending today will be thinking about whether they actually want to step into this space in either in the short term or the long term. I would just say, remember, it is really important stuff, and therefore really worthwhile. And it brings together lots of different sorts of disciplines, but it is really worth people's effort if they're willing to put the effort in. And speaking about effort, I will very happily be one of the people that sort of picks on some of these questions that we haven't had a chance to respond to and follow up.
And my last point, before I hand back to you, Oliver, is that I think Remcos in both private and public sector, good Remco is a good Remco. Contexts are very different, but I think applying that in both public and private sector is absolutely well, it's very rewarding, actually, I would say. Oliver, thanks very much. Back to you.
Gosh, what a huge thank you to all our panelists, Christine, Tanuj, Tom, Rupert and Mike. You've kept well over 200 participants engaged for over an hour for those who are in the UK, but almost to dinner time. As discussed, we will follow up on those questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. Another signal of a highly engaging session that there are just way more there than we've had time to answer. If you're watching this and you're interested to find out more about Nurole's events, you can find them on www.nurole.com/Nurole-events. And if you'd like more sessions on around this topic or other topics, you can submit your request there, and hopefully we can persuade Rupert, Mike, and others to extend their knowledge again. If you enjoyed today, you might also enjoy the Nurole podcast, Enter the Boardroom. Do check it out. We had Lynn Weedle recently featuring there on similar topics. And if you'd like to find more about 3XO, do check out their website, which is www.3xo.co.uk. So that brings this evening's event to a conclusion. Rupert has done a brilliant job of chairing this and finishing us bang on time. So thank you all very much and have a good evening. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.